Colton Briggs is coming.
He's here!
Sound like he's the one who's scared.
My whole life, I'd seen fear in the eyes of every man I ever met.
Please don't kill me. We are talking The Old Way, and this one is directed by Brett Donowho and stars Nicolas Cage. You've also got a supporting role here from another recognisable face, being Clint Howard. So, what is the story with The Old Way? Let me just explain that title first of all, because it kind of forms part of the actual story. So, this is a Western movie taking place in the Old West, but the kind of the time period where this is taking place is kind of a transitional period. At the beginning of the movie, we have a kind of flashback, and in that period of time, it's frontier justice. It's the Wild West. You know, people having shootouts to kind of settle beefs and things like this. But the bulk of the story takes place 20 years later, where the government has now more kind of oversight. Law is kind of more organised. And, you know, you can't kind of have that kind of frontier justice, that kind of like eye for an eye kind of attitude anymore. So that's essentially what it's referring to, is that there's characters here who essentially want to settle things the old way. Now, Nicolas Cage plays a character we see in the beginning movie who seems to be somewhat of a ruthless and callous kind of either like mercenary, bounty hunter, something along the lines of that. Essentially a killer for money in some respects, and you know, he's quite, as I say, cold whilst doing it. And we see there's a scene at the beginning of the movie that kind of sets it all up, where he ultimately is responsible for this criminal being kind of like hung, except the criminal's brother tries to kind of free him, and it ends up in a shootout, and we have Nicolas Cage essentially killing this guy, but this is witnessed by this young boy who Nicolas Cage had just killed his father, and obviously, you know, this little kid, when he gets older, he wants revenge. Cut to 20 years later, Nicolas Cage is now living the peaceful life. He's got a wife, he's got a young daughter, and seemingly has given up his violent ways. However, this young lad that we saw in the intro is now grown up, become a criminal in his own right, and his gang is running to try and kind of collect some money, but on the way he wants justice for the murder of his father, and seeks out Nicolas Cage's character, does him a wrong, and now Nicolas Cage in turn wants revenge, and ultimately becomes a kind of lone wolf and cub as Nicolas Cage drags his daughter in search of these kind of criminals who have wronged him. Now, what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what I think works in this movie. So this is a lower budget kind of Nicolas Cage movie, and we've seen these kind of like older kind of stars do the kind of the geezer teaser thing. Obviously, Bruce Willis is well known for doing loads of these type of films, but it's not just, you know, Willis. There's plenty of other kind of stars now who are once a kind of like a big star and whose fame has kind of somewhat dwindled. And Nicolas Cage has done a few of these movies. The one thing I would say is Nicolas Cage compared to a lot of these kind of like these aging kind of actors, is I always feel Nicolas Cage fully commits to his roles, regardless of how kind of like silly they might be or kind of how low budget the movie is. Unlike some of the kind of the actors that I think do these kind of like lower budget, sort of straight to kind of DVD, straight to VOD movies, Cage always, I think, goes, you know, both feet first into his characters, and I think this is true of this movie. I do think Cage is somewhat miscast, and I'll tell you why that is in a minute, but nonetheless I do feel, you know, he's taken this role kind of seriously and, you know, committed to the role. I really like the interactions with him and his daughter. The daughter, I think, is played very well, and you'll be reminded of as I've mentioned, the kind of the lone wolf and cub style kind of storyline. And we've seen that in movies like Leon, we've seen it in movies like Logan, and even recently in the kind of the TV show The Mandalorian. So it follows that kind of same kind of template, an experienced kind of violent man having to kind of take on this kind of child on their kind of path, and ultimately kind of work as a team, both learning from each other. And that's essentially kind of what this movie is. So if you enjoy that kind of lone wolf and cub style adventure, then I think maybe you'll like this movie. Yeah, okay, it's not the most original kind of story, but I still feel it's an enjoyable one. Whenever I've seen a variation of that kind of storyline done, I have to say I do kind of quite enjoy it. And these things do tend to be popular, so must other people. But I do feel this movie kind of layers in some other interesting aspects as well. There's an element here of, and I don't want to give too much away here, of a mental illness to a certain degree, but obviously during this kind of period of time, something along the lines of this might not necessarily kind of be recognised. But there are elements here where, again, a character certainly seems to have some type of mental struggles, let me just put it like that, but it seems to be something maybe inherent that maybe you'd pass down. So essentially maybe some type of genetic mental problems, things like that, and I think this movie, you know, it adds an interesting wrinkle into the movie. Now, when it added that, I kind of to a degree, I thought, what's it going to do with that? And it does call back to it, but it's quite subtle, and I actually kind of quite like that subtle kind of like payoff of that. And I actually have to say, I think people will miss that kind of where that's paid off, but I thought that was kind of quite well done, I have to say. The movie is kind of quite well shot, I have to say. We have these kind of like obviously outdoor kind of sequences with the kind of the sprawling kind of landscapes, and it's all kind of quite well photographed, things like this. There are a couple of interesting kind of shootouts. I think the characters are kind of quite well developed here, and they have some interesting kind of personality kind of quirks. I think the real strength here, though, I feel is Cage's relationship, or Cage's character's relationship with his daughter. And the daughter, I think, to be honest with you, is probably here the standout for me, giving us a very kind of solid kind of performance here. That I think you can really kind of root behind. And their changing kind of relationship as the kind of the story kind of goes on. Their kind of relationship changes. Obviously, Cage is, at the beginning of the film, we see him, he tends to leave his wife to do the majority of the bringing up the daughter, but he's kind of forced to kind of like take matters into his own hands to a certain degree. The action sequences, I think, are reasonably well done. They're not over the top, they don't seem too sort of like unbelievable to a certain degree. They're relatively kind of low-key, but I think it kind of works in this kind of like lower budget kind of you know, sort of setting. And I have to say, Cage is fairly well suited to a Western and to a degree. You know, he's always been certainly an eccentric kind of character, and it's kind of nice to see him in this kind of like period kind of like setting. Although, again, I somehow think his character is a little miscast here. So let me just talk about that for a second. I think one of the things when you hire Nic Cage, you hire Nic Cage because you kind of want his crazy energy. This is what I think people expect from a Nicolas Cage movie. If you get Nicolas Cage in a movie, I mean, he has this new kind of Dracula character in the movie Renfield coming out, and that looks like balls to the wall kind of crazy. You know, in a lot of these movies, you're looking for that kind of like that Nicolas Cage freak out moment. But here, his character, although I think he kind of suits a Western, and I always think of like Wild at Heart, which is kind of like a modern Western, but his character here, his defining trait is he has this stunted kind of emotional state. So he's very kind of cold and calculated. Almost, you might argue, psychopathic. No emotion. He struggles to really kind of like emote and be, you know, emotive to people, which is kind of like the polar opposite of, I think, what you'd hire Nicolas Cage for. You know, you want Nicolas Cage to be unhinged and crazy, but he's the total opposite. I mean, I have kind of mixed feelings about it, because it obviously means you have a different performance from Cage in a much more restrained role, you know, a much more of a kind of, like I said, a cold and calculating type role, although obviously we do see scenes here where he's kind of emoting with his family members and things like that. But for the most part, you know, his whole point is he's kind of this kind of like very callous type of character. So it's an odd choice to really kind of get an actor who is known for his crazy kind of characters and crazy antics to have him in a role which is completely opposite. So again, I have mixed opinions about that to a certain degree, because you know, you want, as an actor, you want to have range, you want to be challenged. So I understand that, but as an audience member, you maybe you expect a kind of certain type of performance from an actor who is known for that. So what else can I say? Now, I actually still quite like Cage's performance, even though I think he's somewhat miscast. The daughter, I think, has a great performance. Their relationship is great. There's also a smattering of other characters here who I think do a fairly good performance. However, there are one or two who I think ham it up a little bit too much and seem, to be honest with you, quite unrealistic. Now, I've mentioned the movie Unforgiven, that's obviously somewhat of a realistic kind of like gritty kind of western. This does not feel like that at all. It kind of feels somewhat of a kind of polished and sheened version of a western. Now, I'm not the biggest western fan. I actually asked another channel who's known for kind of doing western reviews if they would want to review this one, but they kind of declined. So westerns aren't really my wheelhouse, to be honest with you, but it still felt to me like it had this air of modernness to it, to a certain degree, is the kind of the best way I describe it. Maybe that's down to the kind of the budget, the kind of the western towns and that sort of thing. Maybe look a little bit, you know, like they're not real and things like this, and people aren't just kind of grubby and dirty and things. You know, it has that kind of like modern sheen to it. I have to say as well, I think some of the dialogue here is quite poor. Again, some of the characters seem somewhat of a buffoonish, somewhat kind of over the top and unkind of realistic to a certain degree. You know, and their kind of motivations seem very simplistic, to be honest with you. We have a kind of a wrinkle where we have, as well as these kind of, we have this gang of criminals, we have Nicolas Cage and his daughter, and we have this kind of other kind of element being this marshal and his band of deputies. And I would have liked, though they're in it to a point, I think that adds the extra X factor to it that I think is there a little bit kind of cut short. I would say I would have liked them to have a little bit more impact, to give it. Otherwise, it ends up being somewhat the good guys and the bad guys, and we have, you know, you have this element where you have this third kind of, element to it, this third kind of chapter of people. And I think, to be honest with you, it played its hand a little too early with that one, because that was, to me, an interesting angle where you didn't quite know how they were going to figure into it, because they're the law, they're the good guys. So, you know, how are we going to deal with them and things like that, even though there might be an antagonistic force. But again, they kind of dealt with a little bit too soon, because I think they added one of the more interesting kind of wrinkles into this movie. The movie seems a little kind of tame, to be honest. We see the motivation for Nicolas Cage's character. You don't really see anything on the screen. I think maybe it would have hit more had we seen a little more of that. I think the intro wasn't particularly strong. Again, we don't have some particularly good performances from some of the kind of the smaller parts. Some of the characters don't seem particularly kind of realistic. The dialogue seems a bit hokey at times. But overall, the story is still engaging. I was engaged in the storyline. I really like the relationship between Cage's character and his daughter. They were the heart of the film to me. And I thought their characters were well acted and well written. The movie around it, I would say, is kind of where it just dips a little bit. It's not a particularly high stakes film, but I think, to be honest with you, that's somewhat in the movie's kind of favour. I kind of quite like the ending as well, is what I'll say, without kind of giving anything away. So overall, you know, I don't think this Western is going to, you know, create new fans of the Western genre, but but I do feel, you know, it will satisfy Western fans who kind of want to watch a new Western and certainly see Cage and see what he can kind of do in this kind of role. Albeit this is his first kind of you know, role as a kind of in a traditional kind of Western. I have to say I did enjoy the kind of the lone wolf and cub aspect. I actually kind of was thinking, oh, do you know what? I would like to see a continuation from this as the film kind of drew to a close. Overall, I think it was a little bit of a mixed bag, but genuinely I would say it kind of falls on a favourable side rather than unfavourable. So I will give this movie I'll give it a 6.5 out of 10. I don't have a graphic for that, but it's got a 6.5. I was kind of thinking, is this a 6 or a 7? So I'm going to go 6.5. Even though the graphic's only going to say a 6. Have you seen this movie? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.